Okay, so you've got yourself a camera and you don't really know what you're going to do with it yet. You might have some idea, you may be working in auto mode, which is fine. But if you want to really take control over your photography, then the thing to do is master the exposure triangle. So if you're new to photography, this might all be kind of like arcane arts to you. So I'm going to explain it, and it's basically three pillars. So if you imagine, this is why it's called a triangle. So we have three things to talk about. We have aperture, and that's the size of the opening in your lens. We have ISO, which is the sensitivity of your sensor or your film. And we have shutter speed, which is how long that opening is open for, so how long it lets light in for. Because really, photography is all about controlling light. Now, it's not just as simple as finding how much light to let in, because those three things also affect other elements. So I'm going to go over them and explain them, and in just a few minutes you'll have a really good understanding. And then in future videos we can talk about how you can kind of optimize those different settings for different situations. Okay, so let's start off with the easy one, which is ISO. Now, ISO is basically the sensitivity of your film or your sensor if you're using a digital camera. Now, if you're shooting film, this is really easy because once you put your film in, you can't change your ISO until that roll's done, and then you can swap over to another one. If you're shooting digital, however, you can change your ISO, which gives you extra flexibility. But do beware that if you increase your ISO, so if you increase your sensitivity, you will introduce more noise. Now, that's less of an issue these days than it used to be because you can fix that in post much more easily than you used to be able to. So don't worry too much. But if you're in a darker situation or you're shooting at night, you will need to increase the ISO and you'll need to deal with the extra noise. Shooting in film, generally speaking, the lower the ISO, the cleaner the image, but the higher the ISO, the more grain you're going to introduce. Now, ISO is usually measured in something like 100, 200, 400, 1600, and the difference between the film speeds is measured in stops, as are the other two parts of the exposure triangle. Um, so if you go from 200 to 400 speed film or 200 to 400 ISO on your digital camera, then you're increasing your ISO by one stop. Keep that in mind because stops are important. Okay, so the second part of our exposure triangle is shutter speed, and this is how long your film or your sensor is actually exposed to light. And this is measured in fractions of a second. Sometimes they'll go down lower than or longer than a second, but for the majority of the time, you'll be shooting at fractions of a second. Now, this serves two purposes. It lets you balance out the other two parts of the exposure triangle, which we'll get to once we've covered all three, but also lets you either blur or freeze motion. So let's take an example, say street photography. Say you want to capture a moment and you want the people in your scene, in your frame, to be caught and still without any blur at all. So you're really going to look at, say, 250th of a second. That's a good speed for that kind of work. Obviously, this is going to change depending on the weather and the other settings of your camera, what you're trying to achieve. But that's a good starting point. If you're a sports photographer or wildlife, if you're trying to shoot birds or cars or motorbikes, all that kind of stuff, then a thousandth of a second is going to be what you're going to go for. Now, this is also measured in stops, but if you look at the top of your camera, you'll see the dial here. I'll punch in a close-up so you can see better, or you can look at your own camera if you've already got one. So you have a series of numbers around this ring. We've got 125th, 250th, 500, 1000th of a second. This is a film camera, so they don't always go above a thousandth. Sometimes they do, more modern ones will, but a thousandth is probably where they're going to top out. Now, these numbers, again, although they have those separate numbers, which is the actual measurement of time that the aperture is open for, they're also stops. So the difference between 250th and 500th is one stop. So put that in the back of your mind and keep it there with the same thing as we did with ISO, which is also measured in stops. And then we'll come back to it and I'll explain how they all kind of sit together, the three parts of the exposure triangle. Okay, so the third part of our exposure triangle is aperture. Some people say iris. That same thing. If you hear those terms, it means the same thing. And it's the opening inside your lens that lets the light through, dependent on the shutter speed. So some of this might sound a little bit backwards, but don't be confused. It's really simple. And basically, you will have a ring, most generally. On a film camera, it will be a ring. On a digital camera, it may be a ring, or it may be, some cameras have a dial here. Some it might be a menu button on the back that allows you to then use a control wheel or something to change your aperture setting. Generally speaking, it will be on the front here. And what this does is it changes the settings, which is the size of the opening in the lens. So the same way the shutter speed controls the time that this is open for, the aperture control changes how much light is exposed during that time. So a bigger aperture, which strangely has a smaller number, will let in more light, and a higher number, so a smaller aperture, will let in less light. Now, the numbers on the ring, again, usually measured in stops, will go from anything, say 1.2 or 1.4, in this case 1.8, all the way up to f22. The top limit on different lenses will change, but it's usually around there. And you will find that you'll have, I don't know if you can hear that. So those clicks will be generally a stop. So if you look on your lens, if you look at the aperture ring, you'll have, say, f4, f5.6, f8. Well, the difference between f5.6 and f8 is one stop. So just like ISO and shutter speed, these things are measured in stops. Again, put that aside for now. We'll get back to that in a minute. Now, what does f mean? And the number after it, because they seem kind of arbitrary, right? There's no real sense to them unless you understand what they are. So they're basically, this is just a little bit of maths, which you don't really need to worry about, but I'll tell you just so that you know. So if we look at, say, f2, and the f represents the focal length of a lens. So if you've got a 100mm lens, f2 is half of that, and that is the measurement of the aperture. So again, well, it doesn't really matter what it is. All of those is a mathematical equation, and the f-stop is basically the focal length divided by the number that you pick, f8, whatever it is. Now you might think, well, the length of my lens, so this is a 50mm lens, which could be about 50mm in length, I suppose, but it's actually about kind of there's a point inside the lens which defines the actual physical measurements. So a 100mm lens isn't necessarily 100mm in length. Sometimes they are, especially in older lenses, you'll find that more. But just something to keep in mind. Don't worry about it too much, but if you want to understand what those F numbers mean, that's what they are. Some lenses will let you pick between two f-stops. So you might have f8 and an f11, which might give you 3 clicks between the two kind of numbers on your lens barrel, and that's just third stops, which is useful in some situations where you want to really kind of like dial in an exact exposure. But all you really need to know is lower number, bigger aperture, lets in more light. Now, what this does to your image is maybe unexpected. You may have seen this. So if you're looking at, say, portrait photography, you might see those kind of like wonderfully smooth out of focus backgrounds where the subject of the photo really pops. Now this is achieved by using a big aperture, so a low number, which is why lots of portrait people like to choose a lens with, say, like a 1.2 widest aperture. But if you're a landscape photographer, clearly you don't want that. You want everything to be in focus. So you're going to be looking at the upper end here, so like your f16s and your f22s, or even higher, because the small aperture gives you the greatest depth of field. So keep those in mind again. We'll move on to how the interplay between these three things works, and it's all kind of relative. So once you define your aperture, then you can kind of look at once you define your exposure, sorry, you can then go into explore which parts of these you want to use. Okay, so what does this mean in practice? Well, it all depends on the intention of your photograph. What are you trying to achieve? Let's just talk about an example. Now, ignore the numbers, they're not important because this is going to change no matter what the shot is. But let's say in our camera we have ISO 400 film loaded and we set our shutter speed for say 250th of a second and we're doing some street photography. Our light meter tells us f8 because of the lighting in the situation and what we're doing. And you're looking at the scene and there's a lot of very fast moving traffic and you want to freeze it, or there are kids running by or something you need to capture and you want to freeze it in time. That might mean that 250th of a second isn't quite fast enough and you're going to have some blur in there, motion blur. Well, to counteract that, you need to increase your shutter speed, maybe by a stop, to 500th of a second, which is effectively halving the amount of light that enters your lens. So we can't change the ISO unless you're on digital, obviously, but I'd still recommend not doing that. We know our shutter speed needs to increase to 500th. So we've halved the amount of light coming in, and that means that your film is going to be underexposed, or your photo is going to be underexposed. So you need to increase the aperture by one stop. And if you remember back, one stop on the aperture is actually a smaller number. So you need to take that to 5.6, and then you will have the same exposure, the same amount of light entering your camera as if the shutter speed went back to 250th and the aperture went back up, or smaller in size but higher in number, to f8. And it's as simple as that. It's just a case of deciding what's important for your photo and then managing the balancing act between the three numbers. So I hope that's been of some use. Next time we're going to talk more about exposure, and I'm going to talk about the Sunny 16 rule, which means that if you're using an old camera like this, or your battery dies, or you just want to get a deeper understanding, then you can do it just using your eye and some experience and a very basic table that I can share with you. So see you all next time.